Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Strom Webinar Insights webinar series. Through this series, we try to share the active research our Strom College of Business faculty do over here with our community. And I am Yuping Liu Tompkins. I'm a professor of marketing and founder and director of the Loyalty Science Lab at ODU. Today, I would like to share with you a research project we recently did with through the Loyalty Science Lab on the role of ideology and values on brand loyalty, as you can see the full cover of the report here. I know the intersection of what I'm going to be talking about today might be considered to be a third rail in marketing discussions. However, I think this area is a mandatory area that brands need to be aware of in terms of dynamics, in terms of what consumers want. And it's also an area that can present opportunities as well as landmines for brands to navigate through. So before I start, just a quick word about the Loyalty Science Lab. At the Loyalty Science Lab, we strongly believe that as a business, it's as important or maybe even more important to retain and grow your customer base than just acquiring new customers. And so with that in mind, our main mission is to create and promote cutting-edge scientific research on brand and customer loyalty. And through collaboration with industry practitioners as well as academic researchers, we try to answer some of the timely research questions related to managing brand and customer loyalty. And the specific study that I'm sharing with you is coming from the first of our Loyalty Pulse series, where we try to do specialized compartmentalized research on some special topics that are particularly relevant to today's environment. So let's go ahead and jump in. One of the things that I wanted to raise first is a sobering number, I think. The fact that when you look at from our research report, what brands are navigating through is that 66% of the consumers indicating our study that they have walked away from brands because of value misalignment. And 66%. That's about 2/3 of your customers that you can potentially lose over some values related issues. And that provides a important reality, I think, for business to consider how are we standing on these issues and how are we intentionally managing these. And when you think about what consumers are thinking these days, there are a variety of issues they might be caring about. Consumers might be thinking about where the company is standing on sustainability issues, how their employee policies align with their values, or consumers might decide that they're not going to shop there anymore because the company executive said something that they really disagree with. And so this reality really suggests that it's an area that brands cannot hide from, but instead we need to proactively manage this and to really understand what it is that customers want, and to also design brand messaging with these dynamics in mind. So what I would like to talk you through today is, first, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about that value-driven loyalty and from our research findings on how it's impactful, as well as why it's important along the way. And then I will dig a little bit deeper into the role of consumer and brand ideology, something broader than just a typical values perspective. And then I will talk about what are the implications for brand managers. And I welcome your questions along the way. If you have any questions, feedback, or comments regarding today's talk, just put in either the chat or the Q&A section, and we're monitoring that, and I'll leave some time at the end of the webinar today to answer your questions. So the first set of findings I wanted to share with you is how much does value or values really driving customers' decision to be loyal to a company or to a brand. And our research basically shows that 73% of the consumers have made loyalty decisions based on a brand's social political values. This is just over the past 12 months. Now, those things are manifested differently. For some consumers is deciding not to use a brand anymore because they disagree with the brand, or deciding to be more loyal to a brand because they agree with what the brand did. And what's particularly interesting is that when you look at these different potential drivers of brand loyalty, this value alignment issue actually outranks reward programs and personal experience, as well as connection with others. So some of these other frequent branding and marketing tools that we hear about, in many cases, actually not even as important as aligning with customers on value. And when we look at the frequency of consumers engaging in these actions, now there are 27% of the consumers said, they never taken any of these value-driven loyalty actions over the last 12 months. But 31% of the consumers did that actually frequently or consistently, and then another 42% did that occasionally all over the past 12 months. So what this is showing to us is it's no longer a fringe behavior, but it's something that's happening mainstream and that brands need to understand. And what's interesting is that when you look at the different types of loyalty, specifically, we look at 3 different types of loyalty. One is purchase-based loyalty, or many of you are probably more familiar with the term of transactional loyalty, that's defined purely from a behavioral perspective. Another type is advocacy loyalty, not just being loyal to a brand, but be willing to advocate for the brand in front of other consumers. And finally, the emotional loyalty, which is the feeling of a deep connection with the brand. And so when you look at how important value alignment is to each of these types of loyalty. Now, for purchase-based loyalty, 58%. So what that means is that 58% of the consumers indicate that they consider value alignment in their loyalty decisions related to transactional loyalty. Now, that's already a pretty significant number, more than half. But when you look at advocacy loyalty and emotional loyalty, those numbers are even higher at 71% and 79%. I think what's particularly telling in these numbers is what you see up here when we consider these numbers in comparison with a classic marketing instrument, the price. Right. So when we included price as one of the things that can potentially influence people's loyalty decisions. Now, for transactional loyalty, which is you see as the gray bar over here, the price is definitely very important, and in fact is way more important compared with value alignment. But as we move over to the blue and the orange bars here representing the advocacy loyalty and emotional loyalty, the importance of price steadily decreases and the importance of value alignment steadily increases. What this basically means is that value issues is more than just a potential liability, more than just a landmine that we have to reluctantly navigate through. It is actually something that brands can potentially build on if they wanted to connect with consumers more than just purchase behaviors, if they wanted to gain long-term competitive advantage, wanted to be able to just build a stronger connection with the customers that potentially can be more competition proof, can also bring more long-term value as well. And this is also explaining why some of the brands that have premium pricing can be equally successful in the marketplace by standing on certain values or representing certain values in their marketing and brand messages. Now, having said that, I'm going to say that not all pictures are positive. One of the things that we saw in the study is what I call the asymmetry effect. If you ask consumers whether they have increased their loyalty or decreased their loyalty due to value alignment, we had 66% of the consumers having decreased or reduced their loyalty to a brand because of that value misalignment, while 48% have increased loyalty due to that alignment. So that's an 18-point gap, pretty significant, and it represents a significant level of risk for brands if you're not doing this right. And it's something that, brands need to understand and need to be aware of going into this. Does that mean that because of this, we're going to stay neutral, be afraid of making mistakes, therefore we do nothing? I don't think that's what we're going to see. And throughout the rest of this presentation here, hopefully you will see that opportunities for taking stands and for being able to connect better with customers based on these value issues. However, it also means that you do need to go into this with eyes open and with potentially proactive measures to prevent the risks associated with it. And interesting perspective when we look at how people, individuals, are different in their loyalty decisions and what drives these loyalty decisions. Similar to one of the studies we did a few years ago on the future of loyalty, we again see age as the most important differentiating factor across different demographic factors, more important than gender, more important than income, education, and all of these other things. And what you see here is a plotting of looking at value alignment across the different age groups in the orange line you see here. So what we see is a clear decline over time in importance with age. So before the mid-30s, consumers are much more attentive to value alignment type of clues when deciding whether they wanted to be loyal to a company or not. And after that age threshold, it slowly declines eventually from 62% for the 35 to 44 group down to only 48% for the 65 and plus group. And we see some similar patterns for other types of what we call non-traditional loyalty drivers. So things that are not product features, not price, not the typical customer service that you would think important for loyalty. These are the more non-traditional beyond those traditional influences. So in terms of personalized experience, as well as the ability for the brand to connect them with others, these important drivers also start to slowly decrease in importance as consumers get older. What's particularly fascinating to me, I think, through this research is what we see as a very distinct behavioral pattern from Gen Z, or the 18 to 24-year-olds. As you can see over here on the right side with the graph, 63% of the 18 to 24-year-olds said they have become more loyal to a brand due to social political values versus 51% said they have stopped or reduced buying from a brand due to social political values. Right. So every other group, like I mentioned earlier with the asymmetry effect, is the exact opposite, where they are more likely to punishing brands for not doing what they agree they like versus rewarding brand for doing things right. And for this younger group, however, we see the opposite. Right? Rather than having that asymmetry, their asymmetry goes the other way. What that means is that this younger group of consumers are actually seeking to build relationships with brands, to cheer for brands, rather than finding excuses to try to avoid them. And that's positive news, particularly for brands that are trying to target that age group, that there is real opportunity here by taking stands on values-related issues, by taking stands on these issues to be able to building better connections with this Gen Z group. Now, let me move into something a little bit broader. So we've talked about values so far, but values themselves only is considered to be a part of something bigger in our worldviews, or academically, we call it ideology. Now, traditionally, when you evoke the term ideology, most people are going to be thinking, this is about political opinions, political point of views, which political candidates you actually support. But academic research in both political science, consumption domain, as well as psychology have shown that ideology is actually broader than that. It's considered to be a broader cognitive framework that can shape how we interpret information and make decisions. So it extends way beyond politics into our everyday life decisions, including the decisions we make regarding what we buy and which brands we consider ourselves loyal to. So think about a very simple example here. Let's say I'm a coffee shop and I am putting in my marketing messages that I ethically source our coffee beans, right? So a pretty fairly standard message coming from a coffee shop. Now, that one message or same message, depending on your ideological standpoint, you might interpret it very differently. One set of consumers might consider that to be a really positive thing that makes them want to go to the coffee shop more because they consider it to be an authentic commitment to equity and ethical business practices, a positive thing essentially for those consumers. Now, another group of consumers looking at the same message might think of it as a negative thing. They might think that this is nothing other than marketing gimmicks in order to achieve some kind of premium brand positioning, right? So this is a negative reaction here. And then a third group might even be thinking that maybe the company did this as a necessity for regulatory compliance purposes. And so for that group of consumers, it's neither positive nor negative. It's just a necessity for business. And so you can see that the same marketing message or the same product feature can be interpreted very differently depending on how consumers actually view the world and where they stand in terms of ideology. Now, I know some of you might be wondering, what does this have to do with businesses? Right? This is something that, maybe happens in everyday conversations, but shouldn't businesses kind of avoid those things, avoid talking about these kind of controversial topics? And so I wanted to present some evidence that suggests that perhaps not. One of the things is I wanted to show you here an interesting article that was published by New York Times late last year, looking at how business distribution, so in other words, the density of different types of businesses in different sectors, are already reflecting regional values differences. So for example, when you look at, golf course, it has a higher density in Republican-leaning areas. Breweries, on the other hand, have more businesses in the Democratic precincts. Baseball fields, more Republican-leaning areas. Comedy clubs, the opposite. And so what these areas are suggesting is that you as a business with a location, you are already influenced by the macro environment that's surrounding you. Even if you think you've never taken any stance, you are not doing any of values-related activities, it's more than just what your business does. It's the environment that's enveloping you that can potentially influence how your brands are perceived and how customers might react to you. And as additional evidence, sorry, the numbers are kind of got skewed over here. The additional evidence come from our study where we asked consumers to kind of rate some of the pretty well-known brands on the ideological spectrum, going from extremely liberal to extremely conservative. So basically 1 being extremely liberal and 7 being extremely conservative. And we see clear groups of brands that belong to along the way on the spectrum here. For example, Ben & Jerry's, the average rating is about 2.4, which places them right about the liberal kind of region over here, versus the New York Times is also considered to be liberal, slightly less extreme in that case. On the other end, we have Tesla at a 5.2 on the conservative, as well as the Fox News is a 6.0. And then the other two brands, Hilton and GameStop, are considered relatively neutral or moderately perceived brands that are in the close to the middle of the scale here. And what's fascinating is that consumers don't necessarily see the brand's ideology that same way. When you look at, for example, New York Times, the liberal consumers are rating New York Times as 3.5. So liberal leaning for sure, but it's more closer to that 4-point middle point. The versus conservative consumers are rating New York Times at 2.7. So further along the way, more towards extreme liberal end of the spectrum. And Tesla is the opposite example, where liberal consumers rate them as 5.7, so quite conservative, versus conservative consumers rate them just slightly above that midpoint at 4.7. So that's a 21% gap for Tesla and a 30% of the perception gap for New York Times. And why is that? I think these numbers really indicate a potential tendency for consumers to overestimate the differences they have with brands that don't necessarily match their values. And another point I wanted to raise over here is that we might think that all of these perceptions are purely driven by what your brand is doing in terms of the stance that you take, whether that's DEI issues, whether that's sustainability or equity issues and so forth. But it's not just that. It's not just explicit political statements or social political statements that you make as a brand. It's also in everything you do. As we'll see later, it's reflected in how you treat your employees. It's reflecting where you advertise, what you say in your advertisement. It's just reflected in pretty much everything you do as a brand. So therefore, it makes it particularly important that you understand what will drive consumers' perception of your brand along this spectrum and how they will see themselves as aligned or not aligned with you. And so talking about alignment, one of the significant findings from our research is the fact that ideology in terms of how consumers perceive brands to have, in conjunction with the consumer's own ideology, really affects people's loyalty decisions. And so what I show here are 3 different categories of brands. So the liberal, what consumers perceive to be liberal-leaning brands, what consumers perceived to be conservative-leaning brands, as well as brands that are kind of more in the middle. When we look at consumers who claim that they are loyal customers to these brands, when you look at the distribution, it's very different across these different categories. For loyal brands on the left side, for example, you see twice as many liberal consumers to be loyal customers for those brands compared with conservative brands, actually more than twice here. And then on the other side, with the conservative ones, conservative perceived brands, we see kind of the opposite pattern. So we see 54% of those loyal customers to be also conservative customers and 32%, so slightly more than half, to be liberal customers. And so still a very uneven distribution. In the middle over here with moderate brands, we see a little bit more balanced perspective with liberal consumers 47% and the conservative consumers 35% of their loyal customer group. Now, what this means is not necessarily that you should be just in the middle in order to appeal to a wider segment. I think that for every brand, all of these different categories, you can still see all groups of customers still belonging to the loyal customer of that particular brand. However, at the same time, you also can think about the potential strength of the appeal. If you're able to do the value alignment right with your core customer group, it can potentially have increase the loyalty of your customers to your brand. And when we look at the same thing for the most liberal perceived brand and the most conservative perceived brand, in our study, we included a total of 8 different brands. Our most liberal one is the Ben & Jerry's, as perceived as the most liberal among consumers. And the liberal consumers consist of the liberal consumers account for about 69% of their loyal customer group versus 20% for conservatives. And Fox News is kind of the opposite with 71% conservative audience, loyal audience, and 16% coming from the liberal audience. And so this almost mirroring structure with each other is really telling of how important that ideological fit between the brand and the consumer can potentially play a role into what consumers are doing. And like I mentioned earlier, these type of perceptions can come from many sources, whether your brand is making political statements or not. So, and whether you like it or not, consumers are going to see you one way or the other. And the important thing is that you as a brand, are you intentionally managing it, or are you kind of let it be random and let consumers take control of it without you being able to kind of more carefully managing what it is that you want it to be perceived as. And when we broke down the consumers by their own ideology, we also see quite interesting distinctive patterns of how they make their loyalty decisions. And so starting with the liberal leaning consumers. So these are consumers who are kind of on the left side of that ideological spectrum. These consumers are the most likely among the three groups to define loyalty or see loyalty as emotional loyalty. So I mentioned earlier that represents a deeper connection with the brand. And 55% of those have become loyal to brands due to value alignment, and 76% have reduced loyalty because of value misalignment. So they're the most likely to be influenced by values alignment issues. Interestingly, they're not valuing the ability for brands to enable connection with others in their loyalty decisions. So from that perspective, perhaps this group of consumers are valuing more of a macro connection in the sense of the society being connected on these important issues, but less valuing the role of the brand in making specific connections to individual others. And if we look at the right side with the conservative leaning consumers, these consumers are also quite likely to engage in value alignment-based decision-making when it comes to brand loyalty. But differently, they are most likely among the three groups to see loyalty as advocacy loyalty, so advocating for the brand when they feel loyal to the brand. Their tendency for value alignment is somewhat lower compared with the liberal leaning consumers. And then finally, when you look at the different types of loyalty drivers, they're the ones that put more weight onto reward programs as well as onto personalized experiences. So personalization means more to this segment. And then for the moderate consumers, these are the consumers who takes the most pragmatic approach. They are most likely to see loyalty just as transactional loyalty, and only about 28% of them have become loyal because of value alignment, and about just slightly under half have reduced loyalty due to misalignment. Instead of those other non-traditional factors, they play the greatest emphasis on price in their loyalty decisions. So a fairly price-sensitive group. And what this is really demonstrating to us, going back to the earlier question about should me as a brand to just stay in the middle as moderate to appeal to the widest segment of customers. Maybe the answer over here is maybe not, because when you're looking at the moderate consumers, they are more likely to be the ones to place price, which puts pressure on your profit margin, and also may potentially be more prone to be lured away by competitors because of their product offerings, because of their deals. So there is value actually in targeting some of these more having clear leanings in terms of their ideology. And another point I will share with you before we jump into the strategic implications is the comparison between internal politics or internal actions versus external public statements. So on the left side, you see here is a significant internal company issue is in terms of how employees are treated at the company. On the right side, you have external things that public endorsements that companies or brands might make from time to time. So what we find is that internal employee practices is a really strong driver of customers' loyalty decisions. For example, for female consumers, if they receive information about you mistreating your employees or about the policy about employees that they disagree with, they can have a significant drop in their loyalty towards you, as much as 2 out of 3 points. And so the impact on the other fronts in terms of if you are doing a good job treating your employees, they can also have, those kind of actions can also have a significant positive impact. So female consumers in general shows a little bit stronger impact in this domain. Public endorsement on the right side over here, it still has pretty significant impact. For example, if liberal consumers disagree with the political endorsement that your brand does, the liberal consumers can reduce their level, maybe like halfway point on the loyalty scale. So what this basically means is that both of these things matter. However, in comparison between the two, perhaps other than thinking about the public stances you can take on some of these issues, the first and foremost you need to do is take care of your own house, right? Making sure that you are treating your employees right, making sure that the employee policies you have, who you hire, and all of those practices are in line with what your core target customer group is going to be expecting. So what does all of that mean for brand managers? I think I'm going to quickly talk about 4 different implications for brand managers: authentic alignment, strategic segmentation as another possibility, and the need for risk management protocol, and also driving a strong internal focus. And I'm going to try to get to each one of this in turn. So thinking about authentic alignment, this is basically the idea of trying to identify what are the core values that you consider as a brand, like what is really you as a brand. And you wanted to identify those brand values, and whatever you do, whether it's marketing messaging, your product packaging, and all of that can reflect that identity, can reflect that authentic values that your brand stands for. And so I'll use some examples over here from the recent DEI controversy. You guys probably have all seen in the news that in the US, a lot of brands are under pressure regarding DEI initiatives. Some of the brands, some of the big companies such as Costco, for example, have faced boardroom proposals that ask them to eliminate or significantly reduce their DEI programs. And I put some quotes from each of these brands over here. Now, some brands cave into that pressure. Some brands are basically either scaling back or taking it away altogether. But some of the brands that I'm showing over here are standing firm on those DEI initiatives. Delta Airlines, for example, made an explicit statement saying that DEI is about talent, and that's our focus. We are steadfast in our commitment because we think they're actually critical to our business. Right. And the Ben and Jerry's statement is even more intense and extreme. Now, would that turn off some consumer segments who may disagree with them? Sure. However, remember that Ben and Jerry's for the longest time have stood for what they're stating here. And so as a result of that, they're not just taking a stand all of a sudden to perhaps evoke attention, to be part of a controversy. They are sticking to the truth of what the brand actually represents. And that's what makes it work for the brand. However, one thing you have to keep in mind is that not all brands have the luxury to be able to engage in that authentic alignment. So for some brands, you may not necessarily have as strong of brand identity, essentially, to be able to do what Ben & Jerry did, what Delta Airlines did, or what Costco did. Or maybe you had some kind of identity before, but it's no longer as appealing to today's environment, and you're in the midst of changing what your brand stand for. So in those situations, there is an alternative approach where you can engage in strategic segmentation, which means that you're tailoring your values messaging to different consumer groups based on what their values are. So a really good example of that is the Ford reorganization that happened, I think, in 2022, 2023. So in that reorganization effort, among the consumer products division, they actually created two separate parts for it. One is the Ford Blue division on the right side you see here, that are sticking to the classic or iconic Ford vehicles that are mostly internal combustion engine based. And they try to appeal more to the conservative value customers and following up on, on dreams, on their passions in life. On the other side, they created also a Ford Model E division. So this division is appealing more for the liberal value consumers and focus on electric vehicles, connected vehicles, and try to focus on the future as, as the source for innovation and growth. So by making these different distinctions and managing their marketing campaigns intentionally along these lines, Ford is essentially trying to kind of mix up their old brand identity to be able to appeal to consumers of different segmentations strategically. And then the last two, I'll talk very quickly here. One is the risk management protocol. So the asymmetry effect that we saw earlier suggests that there is really indeed a significant risk in navigating this area. And so you need to be prepared for it. You need to have scenario protocols. You need to have when it comes to crisis situations, what you're going to say, how you're going to say it. And you also probably should have standard ways of judging whether and when the brand should jump into potential controversies. So it's very important to kind of manage that risk process there. And then finally, our research on how much impact that employee experience can potentially drive brand loyalty. You also need to really make sure that you take care of that front as well. Employee experience is fundamentally the source for customer experience. And so when you treat your employees well, you are essentially improving the customer experience and the consumer's perception of you as a brand. And it's kind of like, marketing messages, what you can do is you can say certain things about who you are. But I think these employee experiences are really what you do that consumers are watching to see if you really do what you say your brand stands for. So as a general suggestion for getting started, if your brand wants to do more in this area, I think as a first step, you should consider, a better understanding of where your brand stands at this moment in time, and through a brand values audit. So the questions you can ask include, for example, how do different customer segments perceive your brand? What value associations are already made to your brands in consumers' minds? And where does your target audience fall on that ideological spectrum? So gaining a better understanding of yourself, and then following that with a better understanding of your brand, you need to identify some high impact touch points. So when I say identify high impact touch points, I mean that you cannot necessarily take care of all of these across every part of the business process. That would be the ideal scenario. However, for initial implementation, it's best to prioritize the different touch points that consumers can potentially see. And you can look at each of the touch points on two different dimensions. One is potentially the visibility of that touch point in consumer interactions. So things like product design, packaging, customer service might be the more visible points, versus maybe the supply chain will be less visible, however, still can be opportunity points for you as a brand to express your value. So one aspect you wanted to see is how visible those touch points are. Number two is how much opportunity that a specific touch point can provide for value expression purposes. So thinking through different types of businesses, for example, when you think about fashion company or fashion brands, perhaps their high impact touch points is in terms of how they source their materials, and in their marketing messages to their consumers. For a tech company, perhaps is in terms of how they protect consumer privacy and how they moderate content on the platforms. For a restaurant business, it may be how they source their food ingredients, how they engage themselves in the communities they're embedded in. So each business has their unique set of high impact points. And once you identify them, those are the ones that you wanted to first going into to create these kind of values discussion, and to be able to represent a stronger image for your brand on these value issues. And then finally, a lot of times because ideology and values are considered to be the soft benefits that you see from brands, you need to establish a really strong measurement framework to be able to relate what you're doing in these values dimensions to actual business outcomes. So I mean, things that are forward-looking, such as consumer sentiments, such as the projected consumer perception of your brand and so forth, but also backward-looking in terms of retention of customers. Are your retention rates increasing, or are your sales increasing? How's your profit, and all of those things? The key success, I think, is coming from being able to connect those soft benefits or soft things that you are doing to these hard business outcomes, to be able to demonstrate impact and to be able to keep track of what you're doing or whether it is making a positive impact for your business. So we're coming to the end here, and I wanted to just quickly summarize the 3 key takeaways I hope our research will give you. One is the idea of ideological alignment can really drive emotional loyalty and can enable your brand to have a premium brand positioning. So if you're wondering about how do I break through all the noise and how I can create a stronger connection to my customers, I think this is a potential route that you can consider. Number 2, because of that asymmetry effect, you do need to proactively manage your risk and establish risk protocols in this area as you venture into this domain. And then number 3 is that internal narratives in terms of the employees are really powerful ways of demonstrating your true brand value or authentic brand value to external audiences. So it's something that you really wanted to kind of think about. A lot of times we get so focused on customer orientation that we kind of forget about the consequences for our employees. And so that is something that brands should consider more in this venture into the area as well. So that's all I have to share today. I have a QR code here and the link as well. If you wanted to download the full report, we have more breakdowns by other aspects of our participants with that. And if you're interested in getting more research updates, I have another code over here that you can subscribe to our monthly email newsletter where we provide our research updates as well. So I'm happy to hear your thoughts and answer any questions that you might have.